Amen. All right. So this week in Woke, I was going to go a different direction tonight, and then all kinds of other stuff started happening a few days ago, and in the last 24 to 36 hours, all kinds of other things have been going on as well. So this is the direction I want to go. We're going to talk a little bit more about the woke universe, the critical theory universe, Neo-Marxism inside of the education system, because there have been a couple of really powerful actual developments that have happened just in the last 24 hours or so. But a couple of things have hit the headlines in just the last few days. One of them was a congressional hearing with the Department of Education Secretary. His name is Miguel Cardona, and he was being pressed about who is in charge of education, parents or schools. And so one particular congressman by the name of Braun was pressing this question. You can watch the video out there. He was pushing it, and he was pushing the question essentially: who's in charge? Who's primarily in charge of education, families or schools? And he was using the stakeholder language, because again, that's the language that just gets used right now, is stakeholder language. But the question is asked: do you think parents should be in charge of their children's education as the primary stakeholder? Braun asked. I believe parents are important stakeholders, Cardona replied, but I also believe educators have a role in determining educational programming. So out of the current administration, there's more and more of this kind of language showing up, that schools or the Federal Department of Education is the primary stakeholder in public education. Not parents, not a local school, but the federal system is the primary stakeholder inside of education. So we're starting to see that language show up more and more. This also hit the headlines. This was actually a gubernatorial debate. Terry McAuliffe in Virginia and his opponent, they had this back and forth, and it was the line at the bottom that made the headlines. But again, they were debating who handles education, who runs education, and they're debating back and forth about a bill that Governor McAuliffe vetoed that would have given parents a certain level of power in order to pull books off of library shelves if they felt like it needed to, or veto the purchase of certain books for school libraries and school curriculum. And if you have been paying attention at all to some of these parents who are showing up in some of these school districts, a couple of them are in Virginia, showing up at these school district board meetings and reading what their kids are being required to read. It is pornographic. And I don't use that metaphorically, I use that literally. So the critical theory stuff is just exposed left and right. Pornographic materials being fed to elementary kids, being read out loud for the record, being exposed left and right. So obviously that's a big deal in the state of Virginia. So Governor McAuliffe is pressed on it. Why did you veto the bill that would have given parents more power? And he replied by saying it was not that the parents had the right to veto books, but also take them off the shelves. He said, I'm not going to let parents come into schools and actually take books out and make their own decisions. I stopped the bill, and I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. So that's what made the headlines a few days ago, is a governor saying, I just don't think parents should be in control at all of what's being taught at schools, right? So then this happens over the weekend. A letter gets written by a group of people on September 29th, 2021, so it's a few days ago, from the National School Boards Association. Again, if you've been tracking this, you know that a lot of school boards have had some pretty contentious meetings because parents are starting to look at curriculum. They don't like the curriculum. They're reading the curriculum out loud, and school boards are getting in trouble. The governor of Ohio actually threatened to arrest the president of one school board for the pornographic material that they had put inside of school curriculum. I mean, it's getting heated out there. Parents are uncovering Kindergartners are being divided by race. They're being asked to rank their privilege according to the color of their skin. And you can see these things that parents have posted, these pictures, and these kids are supposed to put their picture on a certain gradation of skin color. And then they learn who's the most privileged and who's the least privileged. I mean, this stuff is just happening left and right all the time. So parents are showing up, and moms and dads are getting upset, and they're starting to say, we don't like any of this, and we need to change the curriculum. Well, there's plenty of school board members who don't like that, and they get a little bit upset that this kind of thing is happening. So this organization that probably very few people even knew existed writes a letter to the Biden administration, the National School Boards Association. And I'm going to read a little bit of this to you because this letter, as I downloaded this and I started reading this letter is one of the most pathetic, angering letters I have read in a very long time. It is chock full of bald-faced lies about schools, and it is some of the most insane stuff written by adults that I have read in a long time. Here's part of what this letter does. And what they're doing is they're asking for the federal government to intervene in school board meetings to protect school boards and their choice of curriculum. So here's part of what they say. Now, this letter is filled with the language of threats and attacks and violence. What they mean by that is that parents have shown up who disagree with us, and they're getting to the mic, they're reading this curriculum, and they're telling us we need to change our curriculum or we're pulling our kids out. They've got a couple of instances listed in this letter of people who've caused enough trouble that the police have been called in and they sort of have escorted people out. But make no mistake about it, when this letter uses the language of attacks and violence and threats, they're talking about verbal. They're not talking about physical. They're talking about people who disagree with them, have different ideas than they do. It is psychological attacks and threats. That's the world that we live in now. So here's part of what they say right at the very beginning. Coupled with attacks against the school board, members, and educators for approving policies for masks to protect the health and safety of students and school employees, many public school officials are also facing physical threats because of propaganda purporting the false inclusion of critical race theory within classroom instruction and curricula. So they're telling the Biden administration that parents have shown up believing the conspiracy that we're teaching critical race theory. Okay? Then they go on to say this propaganda continues despite the fact that critical race theory is not taught in public schools and remains a complex law school and graduate school subject well beyond the scope of a K through 12 class. Those two sentences are bald-faced lies, open lies. And when people write things like this, they depend on people either not knowing the truth, or they think, well, this looks official, it's on letterhead, and it's signed by a lawyer and a CEO, so it must be true. But this is a very common lie when it comes to critical theory. And you'll see this constantly from people who support it, but don't want you to know that they support it and teach it. They'll say critical theory, and we've talked about this a little bit. Critical theory, well, that's a legal theory. It's very complex. It belongs in graduate schools. You'll find some courses, in the Harvard Law School about critical theory, but none of this is happening inside of our K through 12 classes. Well, those are just lies. We actually looked at some of the curriculum last week that's being implemented in Manitou Springs schools. That is critical theory curriculum, right? So bald-faced lies. They just expect everybody to go, okay, well, I guess this is true. So they start there, and then it gets even more exciting. They, in the process of 2 paragraphs, they ask the Biden administration to engage probably every single federal agency outside of the military to be engaged in tracking down parents who disagree with school boards and labeling them as domestic terrorists. This is what they ask. And I'm going to read some of this to you because you don't believe it unless you actually hear it. So I'm sorry for all of the acronyms and the lists of federal organizations that they're asking for help from. NSBA, the National School Boards Association, specifically solicits the expertise and resources of the U.S. Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Secret Service and its National Threat Assessment Center regarding the level of risk to public school children, educators, board members, and facilities. We also request, because we don't want them to feel left out, we also request the assistance of the United States Postal Service to intervene against threatening letters and cyberbullying attacks that have been transmitted to students, school board members, district administrators, and other educators. They want the FBI to track moms who show up at school boards and disagree with the curriculum and label them as terrorists. As such, the NSBA requests a joint expedited review by the U.S. Department of Justice, Education, and Homeland Security, along with the appropriate training, coordination, investigations, and enforcement mechanisms from the FBI, including any technical assistance necessary from and state and local coordination with its National Security Branch and Counterterrorism Division, as well as any other federal agency with relevant jurisdictional authority and oversight. Additionally, NSBA requests that such review examine appropriate enforceable actions against these crimes and acts of violence under the Gun-Free School Zones Act, the Patriot Act, which is where we track terrorists, in regards to domestic terrorism, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, the Violence Interference with Federally Protected Rights Statute, the Conspiracy Against Rights Statute, and executive orders to enforce all applicable federal laws, and it goes on. This is what they're asking for. You think, that's nuts. Who would agree to that? The Attorney General of the United States last night released a memo agreeing to it. Merrick Garland, October 4th, 2021. Here's part of what he says. Coordination and partnership with local law enforcement is critical to implementing these measures for the benefit of our nation's nearly 14,000 public school districts. To this end, I am directing the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working with each United States attorney, to convene meetings with federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial leaders in each federal jurisdiction within 30 days of the issuance of this memorandum. These meetings will facilitate the discussion of strategies for addressing threats against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff, and will open dedicated lines of communication for threat reporting, assessment, and response. I was asked earlier to give just a brief summary of what we're going over tonight. I said we're going to go through the bad news, and then we're going to go through the good news. That's wicked awful, people. The federal government has now decided that if parents show up at school board meetings and disagree with school board members and they feel threatened, that now someone gets on the FBI watch list, is now thrown somewhere inside of the Patriot Act database and is labeled a domestic terrorist because they disagree with public school curriculum. And by the way, public school curriculum, in some cases, that is just wicked, wicked awful. What does this have to do with, let's talk about a couple of things along the way here. What does this have to do with the woke world, the culturally Marxist world? None of this is an accident. All of this is the plan. All of this has been the plan for a very long time now. We've talked about Hannah Arendt. And she's a German Jew. She escaped the Nazis. She became one of the more influential and insightful philosophers of the 20th century. She's Jewish, and she She wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she just lays out, here's how they do it. Here's what happens. Here's who gets sucked in by it. And if you oppose it, here's what happens to you. And she's describing how totalitarians rose to power in the first half of the 20th century. And here's part of what she says about how propaganda works. Because that letter that we read from that school board association is propaganda. Bald-faced lies with a lawyer's signature on it sent to an administration is intended to make us think it's true. I love this thought. The result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lie will now be accepted as truth and truth be defamed as a lie. In other places of her book, she describes how that just actually happens. But that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. Why pepper people with lies over and over, bald-faced, open, provable lies? Why do you repeat them over and over and over and over again? She goes, here's one of the reasons. So that everybody else just loses track of reality. We lose our grip on what is true and false. And she will say later on, this gets used by totalitarians to promise you utopia, to promise you that they can take care of you since you have now been disconnected from reality. The sense by which we take our bearings in the real world is being destroyed. So this is one of the reasons why we say from time to time when we see this kind of stuff, when we interact with this kind of stuff, when we read it, when it comes from the federal administration, we just recognize this is a lie and we refuse to live by it. We refuse to repeat this as a lie. We refuse to believe it like such. We will call it what it is and we will live by the truth. Don't give them your soul. Don't give them your brain. Don't give them your time and effort. Just refuse to live by these lies. Hannah Arendt tells us this is part of what's going on. Now, this dude's a piece of work. His name is John Dewey. John Dewey is one of the most influential educators in America in the 20th century. So when it comes to educational philosophy, what our public schools started looking like in the 20th century, especially K through 12 education, John Dewey is right at the top of the list of people who influenced all of that. Now, part of what's fun about John Dewey's influence is that he was a hardcore communist, an open, bald-faced communist in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. He is the one, now this kind of stick with me here for a second. We were talking about Karl Marx to critical theory and what we're dealing with now. There were two other really important links between Karl Marx and 2020. One of them was that Italian guy by the name of Antonio Gramsci, but the other one was a group of sociologists and psychologists that are called the Frankfurt School. They were a group of professors who also fled Nazi Germany, and they ended up in the Columbia school system, university system here in America. The guy who made sure that they all had jobs here in America is John Dewey. So he had enough power and influence and control to get that group of half a dozen guys in, and it was while they were here in the U.S. that they developed what we now call critical theory. That phrase comes from them. One of them, the last name was Reich. He wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution that became the template for those who started the sexual revolution in the 1960s. So this is who these people are. This is what John Dewey is. So John Dewey, a hardcore Marxist and communist, helping to develop education. And he says stuff like this. The schools are in the current phase, and he believes that they're in their transitional phase. We're on our way to revolution. We're on our way to Marxism. We're on our way to socialism and communism. The schools are in the current phase, the ideological arm of the revolution. And he's talking about public schools in the U.S. So these things need to become the arm where we train kids to become Marxists. This is John Dewey's philosophy. The traditional customs and institutions of the peasant, his small tracts, his three-system farming, the influence of home and church, all work automatically to create in him, the student, an individualistic ideology. Hence, the great task of the school is to counteract and transform those domestic and neighborhood tendencies that are still so strong, even in a nominally collectivist regime. Even where we've already collected some people together and we're on our way, the influence of things like home and the church are still way too strong. They actually still connect students to their neighborhood, to their home, to their local church, to their family, to their friends. They're still way too connected to those things. We have to break those connections and hand them over to the state. So this is John Dewey's philosophy, okay? This is these people's philosophy. This is just the latest iteration of this. And then our old buddy Karl Marx, he wrote, "The education of all children from the moment that they can get along without a mother's care shall be in state institutions." This is his vision. As soon as they're weaned, we stick them in state institutions. They belong to us. He actually wrote inside of the Communist Manifesto that parents are oppressors because they own their child's labor. The only way to free children from the oppression of having their labor owned is to separate them from their family and give them to the state. Because if the state owns children, there's nothing wrong with that at all. What could go wrong with that, right? So this stuff has been going on for a long time now, and we're actually starting to watch it happen in really significant fashions. That order from Merrick Garland said within 30 days of this order from last night, we're going to create these dedicated channels of communication. He could not stand his kids. No interest in his own family. He was a hardcore racist, a hardcore anti-Semite. He was an absolute mess. He had a child out of wedlock that he ignored, the whole thing, right? But the state has to take over. I was telling Heather earlier today, all the stuff I was doing for This Week in Woke was actually really bumming me out. This is hardcore heavy stuff. But a couple of things along those lines. If Marxists, current day Marxists, want to separate children from families and churches, what should families and churches do? We double down and we say there's no way on earth. We're not going to let this happen. We're not going to let you do this. If you insist on this curriculum, we're out. We're going to create our own systems. Where there aren't already systems, we're going to create them and we're going to make them happen, right? So we've helped start this preschool here at church this year. I love the way Valley Christian Academy does stuff. It's a private Christian preschool. In that way, they keep themselves in their own universe for a lot of things. They're able to control their own curriculum. And as far as I'm concerned, that's far more than just, hey, somebody came to me that you need to use the building. We've got some free space. Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. Philosophically, I'm all in. That we have this option for families with little kids, and we actually create another educational structure for them. I also want to let you guys know, and a couple of my board members are learning tonight that I'm doing this, so I know you guys are thumbs up on all of this anyway. We are aiming at starting what is essentially a small college campus here at church in the fall of 2022. It's an organization called the Virtues Campus. It's connected to this fascinating Indian philosopher's name is Vishal Mangalwadi. And I just like saying that name out loud. So if I just keep saying that name, you know it's just me repeating that over and over again. The school is going to be accredited through CCU. It's not a Bible college, but it will be a full 2-year AA degree that someone can actually get here at the church through the Virtues Campus. So we right now are working on getting that arranged so that we've got another option. So for instance, a student who wants to do this can get a semester's worth of fully accredited college education for less than $5,000 a semester. which is really quite cheap. So we're hoping to get that started, and I need 6 students. So if you know students, let me know. We need 6 students to get this sucker started. That's all. I don't want 6 students. I want 600 students getting started, right? And I've got to tell you, it's not just the preschool and it's not just the university stuff. I want to find ways for this church to support K-12 education as well. I want to find ways, and this has been on my heart, and Wayne and I have had conversations about stuff like this as well. I want to find ways to encourage pastoral and biblical education through this church campus as well. The more this kind of stuff happens, the more these kinds of things inside of me go, we have to do this, we have to do this, we have to do this, we have to do this. There are unique protections that happen when you're a private Christian school, when you're a church, and there are ways to work through the system still right now. So be praying about all of that kind of stuff. And the preschool's going, and we want more kids in the let's just keep praying about that and moving forward as far as that's concerned.